Welcome to Playing Above the Line, where we interview entrepreneurs, business owners, and community activists to get their thoughts and perspectives on leadership. Playing Above the Line is sponsored by Aviso Group, a business consulting and accounting firm focused on preparing clients for the future through innovation and positive growth. Welcome to Playing Above the Line. I'm Alan. And, I'm excited about today's episode because not only is our guest a friend of mine, he's also my pastor at First Baptist Brewton. So our guest today is Cavin Cawthon. Cavin, thanks for joining me.
Hey, man. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's an honor and a privilege. I've been listening to your podcast for some time now. I tell you, you really do a good quality thing, and it's enjoyable to hear, and thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I do want to let you know, because we talked before we started recording, that just because you were on a year after Owen Milligan does not mean that you were any farther down the list than he is. So just for Owen, I know that he listens. Owen, just because you were on before Cavin doesn't mean that you're, above him on
literally
my list.
Every time a podcast would hit, the new one, it would just make me madder and madder because I was that further away from Owen Milligan.
Right.
So.
Well, we finally rectified that situation, so I'm glad you came. I want to talk about a few things because not only are you the senior pastor at First Baptist Church here in Brewton and have been for several years now, but you're also on the mission field in Panama, I know, among maybe in other places for several years, but you're also in the military. Yeah. Your dad was a military guy. You just told me that your son, Preston, is going to Auburn, and he will be in the ROTC, and so we've got all kind of leadership angles to talk about, so I'm excited about that. But just start maybe by telling me a little bit about your call to the ministry because you were in the military. How did that come about? I mean, what made you decide to go into the military and then had that transition into going into the ministry?
Yeah, I grew up in Enterprise, Alabama, which is right next to Fort Rucker. So you have that big military presence. My dad is retired Army. He was a helicopter pilot for 40 years. And so I came from that background. When you're a kid, some kids would play cowboys and Indians. We played war. We were always with our guns and shooting each other and doing that thing. So that was our mentality all the way through. And it was a very natural thing that I would go from that environment to the military. I always knew, and somehow or another, I'd go into the military. My dad didn't want me to join really anything but the Air Force. He had been both in the Navy and in the Army. He started out as an E1 in the Navy, worked up to E5 in the Navy, got out, became a warrant officer, and flew helicopters with the Army. Went from Navy to Army, was a warrant officer, got a field commission there in Vietnam, and became an officer, and then retired a major. So he saw the whole spectrum, and he really wanted me to go into the Air Force. That's what I ended up doing. And really, I think the Air Force helped me a lot. I was one of those kids that didn't have the direction. I tease people. I went to Enterprise State Junior College my first year, and I made the dean's list. It was the blacklist. My GPA was so low, they came to me. I literally had a counselor sit down and talk to me at the junior college and say, college isn't for everyone. And I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of getting serious now. And really, college, I'd gone for 2 years. I ended up going into the Air Force. I went in as an enlisted person. Because of my college, I started in as what's called an E3, Airman First Class, and something happened in basic training that really has affected my whole life. In basic training, you're in a squadron of about 40 people from all over the country, different ethnic groups, all that. We were sitting there, and the drill instructor said, okay, who in here thinks you can beat anybody in this room? Well, I'm young, dumb, and stupid, and I raised my hand and said, I can. He says, okay, you're what's called a dorm chief. You're going to be in charge of this group. And literally from that first day of the Air Force through all of the basic training, I was what's called the dorm chief. And I was the leader of the group. I had to get everybody where they were supposed to be on time. I marched everybody. I did all that. And by me being arrogant and saying that's me, I learned more about leadership right there than I ever have, because people have different mindsets, different levels of intensity, different levels of enthusiasm, and it helped me learn how to deal with that. Did I handle it all right? No, I didn't, but it opened up that door for me to understand that reality. Yeah. And I think that played an important part later on in life. I did go on, I was what's called a life support technician. I was in an F-16 squadron. What I did was I took care of all the survival gear for a pilot. So if he were to eject, I taught him how to eject, how to parachute down. I taught him how to escape and evade. And I was an instructor of sorts, but I also took care of his equipment for any of that stuff. I did well. I enjoyed it. It was a great thing. But one day my commander came to me. His name was Major Hardturn. He says, Kevin, why are you an enlisted guy? Why aren't you an officer? Why aren't you in college? And I kind of beat around the bush, and he says, listen, I really want you to go to school. You need to go to school. And that major really just instilled in me, hey, you need education. We ended up going and being deployed. I was in Desert Storm. Mm-hmm. I was in the 68th Fire Squadron. And one day the major came to me and says, Cavin, listen, if you'll stay another 2 months here, I made it available for you to go back to school. I want you to promise me I want to go back to school. So I ended up getting out of the military. I didn't serve the whole amount of time. I almost served my whole first tour. But that major wanted me to go to school, and he instilled that. So I came out, and God started working in my life, and I felt called to the ministry. I surrendered to be a pastor, and that's kind of that direction of how that turned. And that major, I made a promise that I would go to school to him, and I ended up going to college. I went to the Baptist College of Florida. My undergraduate is, I have a Bachelor of Arts in Theology. I got to do that, and after that, I pastored for about 2 years. Then I went to seminary and got my Master's of Divinity in seminary. But after that was over, I went back to the Air Force Base, and I went back to that major, and he was a colonel at the time. And I got to tell him, hey, I didn't just get my bachelor's degree, but I got my master's degree as well. And I don't even know if he remembered me, but it still meant something to me to be able to go back and do that.
Yeah,
so.
No doubt a big influence on your life. But so talk a little bit about maybe what you learned and as far as leadership, how that maybe translated into the ministry and on the mission field, because you actually built churches in Panama, I know. You started churches, right? You were a church planter.
I became a pastor. I was a pastor for about 10, 12 years, and I'd served in different locations. I served a very small church of about 75. Then I served a church that averaged close to 400. During that time of those 12 years, that's whenever my leadership skills were defined. And one of the key things that I learned during that time, there's really 3 types of leaders that I see, and in the way that I handle things. If you have a group of people and you want to lead them, one leader, it seems like, is always behind the group, pushing them into the direction they want to go. Mm-hmm. And that's very hard. It's very tiresome. It's very taxing because not everybody understands where they're going. They just feel the push from behind. Mm-hmm. Then you have a leader that's in the middle of it, that is working alongside everyone else, and they feel like he's a part of them. They identify with them, and there's a natural flow that everybody's going in that same direction. Then you have another leader that's out ahead of everyone, that's telling everyone, come, follow me, go with me, and trying to get people to buy into their plan, their vision, and all that. But too many times those leaders are out in the front, and they look behind them and nobody's behind them. You know what you call that leader? Yeah. A person just taking a walk. And that's the reality of that style of leadership. And I really tried to pattern myself as a person that was in the middle of that, as a pastor. Hey, I'm willing to wash the dishes just like you are. I'm willing to do things that I'm calling on everyone else to do. I'm not going to ask you to do it if I don't do it myself. And so that's kind of the focus that I've had. But when I was in Atlanta at the larger church I was pastoring, God started opening up some doors. And in that church, we ended up starting 5 churches. Now, these churches were multi-ethnic churches. And what it was I would bring on a staff as an associate pastor of, like, his name was David Bayo. David is Colombian. He was our pastor of our Spanish-speaking congregation. And we started that, so he was associate pastor. We did this with Filipinos, Haitians, and a couple of other groups that we started these with and brought these staff members on and did these groups. And I started leading them. And these were different ethnic groups and very different backgrounds, different cultures. And a lot of times those things would collide. Mm-hmm. You had the American culture, you'd had that African culture, and those two things would hit together and really, it would be hard. So there again, you had to uniquely devise that and plan that out and work in that culture respect instead of just, hey, this is the way we do it here mentality. Right. So as we started doing that, we started these 5 churches. We started seeing them birth out and be their own independent churches. And I really said, hey, if I'm going to do this, if I believe in this concept of church planning, I'm going to do it for real. So I literally left a very strong, sturdy, good church. And Charlotte and I started, my wife and I started praying about, well, where do we go next? What do we do? Are we going to be church planners? And God laid on my heart that I was going to start a church, one church every 2 years. We started looking at places to go. We looked at another place in Atlanta. We looked at Tampa, Houston, New Orleans, different places. But back when I was pastoring in Enterprise, there was this survey that they did in Coffee County, and they said they needed 7 new churches, especially because the military base was growing, didn't have enough churches. So we ended up going back to my hometown and starting a church called the Church on the Circle. It's still there today. It's near the new high school. But we started that church, and it literally was about 7 people that we started with. Within a 2-year period, we got about 100 people were coming to it. But after the first year, I said, okay, what's the next step? Where's the next place we're going to go and start the next church? Again, 1 church every 2 years. Mm-hmm. And a friend of mine that was a missionary on the field, he was a missionary in Lesotho, Africa. He had come in to visit us to see what we were doing at this church plant. He says, Kevin, why don't you go and start churches on the mission field with the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention? And I said, well, yeah, we thought about it in the past, but our son, he's a teenager, and one of their policies is for a new missionary, you can't take a teenager onto the field because of the culture change, because you know how teenagers are. Yeah. It's just hard for them to adjust to that. I said, okay, well, I'll talk to him. So I called him and said, sure enough, that's our rule, but hey, tell you what, let us meet with your teenager and just see. And they ended up meeting with our oldest son, who was our teenager at the time, John Robert, and they felt like he could handle it. So we ended up going, we went to Richmond, Virginia, and did the 6-week training to be a missionary. And then we moved to Costa Rica, San Jose, Costa Rica. And we get to Costa Rica, go to language school for a year. It was an intense time. It was hard. Learning a new language, literally did language school for a solid year, 5 days a week, 4 hours a day. Went to class, had our different assignments, all that, just like we were back in school. So it was a major adjustment. And I was hating life. I mean, just everything about it. We went to McDonald's one time, and I tried to order. And I don't know what happened. I don't know what I said, but I ended up with 10 hamburgers. And I don't know what I said, but I had 10 hamburgers. So life was adjusting. We didn't have a car. That was one of the things. For the whole year, you had to use public transportation. So things were going bad. And I remember going to the grocery store and using a taxi cab. We were getting our groceries out, and I hear this very distinct noise. And it was 2 football helmets hitting each other. I'm like, what in the world? And I look over in a park across from where we lived, this little apartment that we had. There was an American football team out there playing football. And I'm like, Charlotte, take the groceries. Got to go find out what this is about. So I go running over there with my Spanish that I had, and I go to the guys and said, "Oh, hola, yo soy Cavin Cawthon." I didn't know. Again, it was horrific Spanish at the time. And the guy replies to me in English. He goes, what do you want, man? And I'm like, hey, are you Costa Rican? And he goes, yeah. I said, you're playing American football? What's the deal? He goes, yeah, we're part of American Football League. And I'm like, what? I played, of course, everybody plays high school football mentality. Right, yeah. I said, I know a little bit about football. Is there anything I can do to help y'all? He goes, well, really and truly, we have 3 coaches. We have everything we need, but they need refs. Maybe you can be a ref for the league. And they gave me the name of the commissioner of the football for the Costa Rican Football League. A friend of mine, Josh Ayers, he was at language school with me. He played H-back at Georgia Tech, and big guy, I mean, just solid as rock type person. I told him about it. He goes, hey, let's go talk to this guy. Let's see what we can do. So we go and talk to the commissioner, and the commissioner's like, hey, listen, we need people. Well, there's a team near you that has 1 coach, and there's 40 men on the team. And the men range from the age of 18 to 40. And he says, well, y'all go help them. We're like, hey, yeah, we're there. So we went and talked to him, and the guy that was the coach was from Mexico. He played in the Mexican Football League. So I talked to him, and he says, well, what can you do? I said, I know defense. Josh says, I know offense. So I became the defensive coordinator. Josh became the offensive coordinator, and he was the head coach. And we started working with these guys. Remember, 40 guys. And these guys, all they've seen is NFL football. Mm-hmm. So their idea of football was get a quarterback, just throw it to the end zone and see if it catches. So they were playing like junior high football kids. I mean, like you would see at a middle school. And so we started working with them. We went to the basic and just got into it, hardcore South Alabama football. That's what we ingrained into them. And these guys were loving it. And they were eating it up. We had them in the gym. We had them running. We had hitting. It was just a lot of fun. And we were just doing basic things. Ultimately, this kind of a thing, I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings in saying this, but the guy from Mexico was there illegally in Costa Rica. And ultimately, he got deported. So we didn't have a head coach. So they came to me and said, hey, will you be the head coach of the team? I moved to the head coach position. We got another defensive coordinator. We got a couple other guys that were Americans that helped coach, and I got to be the head coach. And this league has started growing, and we got to see some cool things of it. But I got to lead those men. Again, some of the hardest reached people for Christ were young men. They just don't see a need in it. We ended up seeing 12 people come to Christ. We started 4 small groups out of this. But we were also a very good football team. And very proud of that. You know, it's kind of funny. We had this one guy. He was an indigenous guy, 6'4". He was just built. He was in a gang. He came and started hanging out with us. We put a uniform on him, and he played guard. He was mean. He was a mean guy. You know, I came from old school football, so he did something stupid. So I grabbed him by the face mask, and I pulled him in, and I'm starting to say, dude, what do you think you're doing? And just all in his grill about it. And he let go, and he goes, okay, coach. And he goes off and does this thing. Well, I go over to the side, and one of the managers come up and say, hey, man, you don't want to do that to him. He's in a gang. He probably has a knife. I'm like, no, that's not true. Well, we played in a game. We're winning the game. He gets kind of beat up on. And he goes, and I heard him say, I'm going to stab that guy. I'm like, wait, what? So I go over to him and I said, dude, what are you talking about? You're going to stab someone? And he goes, he's been doing whatever to me. And sure enough, he had a knife that was on him in the football uniform. So, you know, that intensity was that.
A little different.
But I was like, this is it. We were supposed to be missionaries in Costa Rica. I was going to coach football, lead these guys to Christ, see churches planted out of this. It was going to be an amazing experience, right? Well, the International Mission Board came to me and says, hey, Kevin, listen, I know things are going well for you. You're supposed to be here in Costa Rica, but we need someone to go to Panama City, Panama. I'm like, what? Are you crazy? I'm not going to leave Costa Rica. This is the perfect setup. I'm in. The league's getting bigger. They got television rights for Costa Rica. They were going to pay coaches. Now, I wasn't going to get paid because of being a missionary, but my staff was going to get paid. The players were ultimately, I think they're getting paid now. So it was really starting to mature up, and it was a very exciting thing that was going on. So I'm not leaving. I'm not going to leave here. They said, well, we need a church planter in Panama City, Panama. So I talked to Charlotte about it, and we started praying about it, and God really said something to me. He says, listen, I didn't bring you here to be a football coach. I brought you here to lead people to Christ, to start churches. And it became real heavy on us. So I literally had to give up that ideal experience, ideal job, ideal everything to be obedient to the Lord with that. And we ended up going to Panama. It was a neat experience. Panama had 9 Baptist churches in Panama City. Panama City is about 1.2 million people. I became the team leader of what's called Urban Panama team, or the UP team is what we called ourselves. Our goal is to start churches, and how were we going to do that? And really what we started doing was we got in with a group of young people that felt like they were called to ministry, and we trained them in church planting. We trained those first 12, and then we started another training, and then we started calling ourselves the Church Planting Institute of Panama. We built up a network of church planters. And before it was over, we had 112 church planters go through our 6-month course. And that's really what we started doing, was started training, leading. We had a process that we carry people through in their training and their practical work, being out on the field. And then we would work with them while they were out of the institute and still check on them, mentor them. And it was a mentor program as well. And we ended up seeing 35 churches started. And we did that in 2 years. 35 churches in 2 years. Now, remember my original thing when I left the church in Atlanta. My goal was to start one church every 2 years. But what took place was we got to Panama, and God had something bigger than that. And we literally started 35 churches in 2 years. And God's plan was so much better than ours. But what I found was, it wasn't that I was starting the churches, but I was being a leader and leading these men and women to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And I went back to that mentality of being in the middle of them and walking with them through that. Right. So we'd spend time in their communities and working with them in the process. And our goal was to be there in Panama City. But I had this one guy call me up one day. It was kind of interesting. His name is Cesar. Cesar called me up. He was in one of my classes. I also taught at the seminary. I was a professor at the Baptist Seminary in Panama. And I taught church planting. And he came to me and says, Pastor, I think I did it wrong. I'm like, what are you talking about? He said, I started a church. I'm like, oh man, that's awesome. And he says, but I didn't do it like you told me to. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, you always talked about starting the church in the city because I'm the leader of the Urban Panama team. He goes, but I went out to a village and I started a church out in a village. I'm like, man, that's awesome. What do you mean? We're here to start churches. It doesn't matter where it's at. He goes, can you come to my church and just see what I've done and kind of walk us through it? I was like, yeah. I said, where is it? And he told me, I'm like, dude, how are we going to get to this place? He goes, well, what we'll do is we'll drive to the end of the road, then we'll get out and we'll walk for 4 hours to the village. I'm like, 4 hours to a village? And I was like, well, 4-wheel drive get us there. He goes, maybe. I'm like, let's try that. So we literally drove this 4-wheel drive vehicle and we got to the village, and it was amazing. This guy started a church. There was probably 120 people in the village. All 120 people were coming to church. He'd baptized 60 people. Wow. And he's wanting to know if he's doing church right. I mean, he was. It was very exciting to see that happen. And that was kind of early in that, probably about 6-8 months into it, that we saw this happen. And that's when we said, okay, we got to do this mentorship. We can't just train them and send them out. We've got to walk with them. And we built this network, and we trained trainers. So we pulled some of the guys that probably weren't gifted as much as others in this and got them to be the trainers, and they would go and work with these churches all over. So it was a process of training. And I always said to them, our goal is to work ourselves out of here, is to not be here anymore. And that's what we did. We literally worked ourselves out. After 3.5 years, we ended up moving to Bogota, Colombia. And we started that same process. And things were happening. The same leadership skills, the same pattern, everything that we implied. God started opening up doors. A friend of mine from Atlanta came down. He was Colombian. He was from Bogota. He introduced me to a bunch of pastors. He said, hey, man, let's go to the radio station I used to work at. And it was the largest Christian radio station in Colombia. And they put me on there, and I got to talk about church planting. The next day, we went to a pastor's conference that he heard about. It was 1,000 pastors, and they put me on stage, and I talked about church planting on the spur of the moment. And remember, this is all in Spanish, so this is intense for me, radio and talking to 1,000 pastors. But God opened up the door and started working. Yeah. But I realized something. The ministry, the job, everything was going well. But there's an element of leadership, I think, and it affects us. And sometimes we overlook. And that's our personal life, our family. While things were going well, I hate to say it, I was moving up that ladder, things were looking well. My kids wanted to be in Panama. That was their home. That's what they knew. And we moved to Bogota, and we saw them implode. It was just a hard thing for them. It was culture adjustment. My kids know about racism. They were picked on because of being white, being American, and they really struggled and really having a hard time. And I couldn't be an effective leader with my family in the way it was. And that's ultimately how we came back to the States. We were in Bogota for exactly 1 year to the day, January the 28th, 2013, and then January 28th, 2014 is when we came back. So,
what you've talked about, but you haven't said the words, but inherent in what you're talking about is the term we've heard a lot on this podcast, even from prior guests, is servant leadership. And part of that is, and you have to deny yourself, right? It's not all about you. Obviously, that's what the word servant implies. That would apply to the people that you're, quote, leading, and also, but what you're saying is your family as well. Yeah.
When I was in seminary, I went to New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. There was a real trendy thing, and it was on leadership. And I actually took 3 courses on leadership while I was in seminary. But that was a new term that you started hearing a lot, was servant leadership. It was in the 90s, you started hearing that term. It started spreading a little bit more. You've heard John Maxwell talk about it. You've heard some other key people about leadership talk about that servant leadership. But the reality is, I'm a believer. I believe that because of my sins, I'm separated from God. I believe God loved all of us enough, so much, that he sent Jesus to die on the cross to save us from our sins. And by having faith in him, then I can have a relationship with God. So my Lord, my Savior is Jesus Christ. But Jesus has set a pattern for leadership. When he was here on earth, he was that servant leader. And he was sacrificial in what he did. It was all about God and giving God the Father glory. And as he did that, he taught those closer to him. And it's interesting to see how he kind of did it. He had the group of 12 we know as the disciples, and he invested in them, he taught them, he showed them. There's a really neat pattern, I think, that leadership should take, and I think Jesus did this. This whole pattern is, okay, this is how you do this. Let me show you what I do. Let me show you what I believe. And then you have that person, and those 12 would come in along with him and do it with him, right? And he actually had them minister with them. But then he got the time, as they did it with him, he got them to start doing the ministry, right? So there was that reality of where they were sent out. The 70 were sent out to go and to proclaim the kingdom of God and to go into a village and tell about the kingdom of God. And if they reject them, they dust off their sandals and come back. But while they're there, they stay in one home. He gave them instructions not to carry back, all that type of stuff. So that happens, but then they came back and they reported to him, and he worked with them. But then there was a time where he left them. He ascended to heaven. This system of training is called MAL. That whole idea of that you model the action, the program, then they come in and assist the program, then you watch them do what you've taught them to do, and then you leave them. And that's vitally important for leaders. If you want to see any structure grow, whether it's a church, whether it's a Fortune 500 business, whatever it is, if you do that, you'll see amazing things take place because you're bringing up the next generation. You're training those people. Your goal in any position you have is to train someone to take your place. I really believe that because your goal is to go to the next level. Right. And I know if you're an owner, that's a totally different thing, but you still have to use that model effect to be able to bring those people up in that. But that's that servant leadership that Jesus showed throughout his ministry. And I really think that's something that if we take those principles, I mean, Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. What if you saw businessmen lowering themselves and washing the feet of their employees? Right. And how that dynamic would totally change everything within that structure. And you think, well, no, I've got to be strong. I've got to be commanding. I've got to be this, that, and another. And I think you're not seeing the big picture of things, though, when you do that. Yeah. There's that iron fist that you can have, but I guarantee you your turnover rate is 100% more. Right. And we're seeing this all the time now, right? We're seeing it in restaurants. We're seeing it in day laborers. We're seeing it in all this minimum wage things. So my thing is, if you've invested, if you're that servant leader, they have a buy-in to it. They have ownership, not of the business, but of what they're doing. Right. And their mentality isn't to sit at home because they're part of something bigger than they are. Yeah. And because that boss, because that owner has invested in them in that way.
Good stuff. I love it. Let me switch gears just for a minute because you are the current pastor at First Baptist Church, Brewton. So as the leader, I know you have a vision for the church because you talk about it all the time, you know, within the congregation. But just kind of tell our listeners, what is your vision for First Baptist in Brewton? We're a decent-sized church in a small town in South Alabama. So as you look forward the next year, 2, 3, where do you want First Baptist to be as we move forward?
That right there is something that we as a staff labor on. I have a great staff. I've got Todd Ray, our worship leader, Mark Edge, our youth pastor, and Tammy Stafford, our children's director. And we're always looking at vision, always looking at where we're leading, what we're doing. We just don't want to be sitting there treading wheels. And I think there's a lot of churches, for that matter, businesses that are just sitting there treading on wheels because they don't have any vision of what's going on. So I think there has to be a time when you sit down and you cast a vision with everybody there. To be kind of crazy, we came up with this big vision of where we were leading the church. Now, remember, I don't want to hurt feelings, but we're seeing the numbers and population in Brewton decline. We've seen that in the last 10 years. It's not like people are moving here and we're seeing growth. We're also seeing some population changes. We are a traditional Southern Baptist church, and part of that is we're a white church. It's not that we're closed off to any other race, but we just happen to be a white church. Well, the white population in Brewton is going down, and you're seeing African-American population in Brewton go up. And we're seeing that pretty much in all southern towns in South Alabama. You have some exceptions, maybe Enterprise, maybe Dothan, some places down in the Foley area and south of there. But on a general whole in South Alabama, you're seeing this take place. So I can sit back and say our goal is to grow. This year, we're running 275 in worship. Next year, we want to run 375. But that doesn't mean anything, right? Those are just numbers. And with the population decline, what does that mean? So we came to a whole respect of not looking at it like that. So we pushed this campaign and just looked at it and said, okay, what we want to be about is people that are growing spiritually and numerically, that we're seeing that take place. We're seeing people give of themselves, not just to be back and be entertained, but we're actually investing ourselves into the church, but just not in the church, but into the community. Mm-hmm. And we're consciously seeking out God in all that we're doing. So we're coming from that mentality and showing people this reality. And we're starting to see some neat things happen. Over the last 4 years, we've literally gone from having one couple in their 20s and 30s. Now we're seeing about 25 couples that are in that age range. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing that change of growth. But I really believe if you come and you sit there and let it be about bigger something than they are, to show them about obedience to God and show them how they can affect the world, you're going to take a 32-year-old that's on fire for the Lord that's going to do whatever. And that's what we're seeing. We're starting to see these young people step up and take on these roles. But lo and behold, what happens? COVID, right? Yeah. I know every guest has talked about COVID. And COVID was hard for us as a church. And it's weird financially. We've literally done better financially in 2020 than we have in the past 5 years. Isn't that crazy? But that's how dedicated the members were. We had people bring their offering up and drop it off at the church every single week. We went to the online giving, and now half of our congregation gives online. Mm-hmm. And it's just amazing how dedicated people are to that. But the reality was, when we stopped having all the services and all the work at the church, it was hard. And we had to come up, we did stuff on the internet. And, the first 3 or 4 weeks, everybody's, okay, we can do this, we'll watch this. And our numbers, we're probably hitting about 300 that were actually watching it all the way through. Because you can tell who starts it and where they get off and all that type of stuff. But after about 3 or 4 weeks, we started seeing those numbers tick down. We were trying to put out Bible studies. I did a thing called the update, and I did all these things. When it all first started, it was new, numbers were good, and before it was all over with, we were running about 30 people watching the worship service that really watched it. Now, we'd have 1,000 click on it, but actually watching it was different. The same thing with every Bible study that we did. We had Tommy Smith do a Bible study. We had other people doing things, but those numbers started going down. And it really affected us spiritually. Another thing that it did was your average Christian that was coming, they found something else to do during that time. They literally said, okay, I'm not in church, I'm doing something else, and I like this. I like this time where I'm just at home. So when we started back, it was almost like starting over again. And we went from averaging 275, 300 in worship to averaging, I think that first month that we were back, we averaged like 150, 140, something like that. Now we've gone up, we're back about 90% of where we were. So I feel like we're making a change there. But before the COVID, your average church member at First Baptist was there about 3 out of 4 Sundays. Now your average church member is there 1 out of 4 Sundays.
Wow.
That's a big difference.
Yeah.
And if you talk to that person that comes 1 out of 4 Sundays, they'll say they're regular attenders. In their minds, they're regular attenders, but that's not true. So our numbers are still changed. We're seeing some growth, but because of those changing, it's making us look like a totally different church. And that vision, we're having to redevelop it now, and that's where we're at right now. We're redeveloping that vision. You think, well, should it change? But yeah, it needs to change. Your vision has to change. I believe a church vision or any business, any function, anything, your vision needs to be so fluid that you're changing every 2 years. If you don't do it, culture is going to surpass you, and you'll be 10 years behind where you need to be in 2 years. Right. I really believe that.
Yeah, because you're not existing in a vacuum, right? I mean, things.
That's right.
You have to react to things around you.
And traditionally, churches, that's what happens. You did well in 1975, 1980, so you're going to do it like you did in 1980, right? And you're going to keep doing the same thing. But I'm telling you, if you don't change between 2 and 5 years, and I really believe 2 years, if you don't change the vision of the church every 2 years, then you're going to miss out.
Yeah, no doubt. That's a great insight, As we wrap up, this has been outstanding, but I do want to ask this question just because I think you're unique in your experiences and background and your worldview. You have the biblical worldview versus secular and that kind of thing. So if I can make that microphone right there magic, okay, and whatever you said in that microphone in the next, few minutes would go out to every person in the world. I mean, everybody would hear it. What would be your message? I mean, if Cavin Cawthon has the ability to say one thing that could reach every living person, what would that be?
I believe everybody is hurting. They feel like there's no hope. They don't see how their life has meaning. And they're just existing. There's too many people that are just trying to exist. Go to work, see about family, start over the next day. And that's not the way God created us. God created us in such an amazing way so that we could have, first off, a relationship with Him, and second off, full and abundant life. And there's too many people that are living such dark and defeated lives. And the only thing that can correct that is a true relationship with Jesus Christ. Without that relationship, you're going to continue just to wonder. You're still going to try things. You're going to think that the answer is money, the answer is a house, the answer is your kids, your answer is your marriage. And all those things are going to let you down. Every single time they're going to let you down. But Jesus loved us enough where He died for our sins so that we could have a relationship with God. And He will never let us down. If you feel empty, if you feel like there's no hope, if you feel like there's no future, if you're just existing, I want to encourage you to turn to Jesus Christ.
Well, we will link your information in the show notes. If people have any questions about what you just said, they can contact you, contact the church. You'll be glad to talk to them more. Cavin, thanks so much. This has been great.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you did, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. It definitely helps us in the ratings, and it also makes it easier for other folks to find the podcast. And as always, a big thank you to producer and editor Carrie Wolf. Playing Above the Line is sponsored by Avizo Group. If you want to know more about who we are and what we do, you can visit our website at avizogroup.com. That's AVIZO group.com. You can also check us out on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thanks for listening.